This is Parshas Kisavei. Parshas Kisavei is 122 psukim. For Sefer Dvarim, it's a large parsha. It may be one of the largest parshas of Dvarim. It may actually be the largest. I don't know which parsha in Dvarim has the most psukim, but 122 is considerable. But more than half of Parshas Kisavei is the Teichacha. More than half of Parshas Kisavei is the Chitas of Friday, which is like 60 psukim. The miracle of these 60 psukim is that for the most part there's not that much Rashi. Now don't misunderstand, the fact that it doesn't have Rashi doesn't mean it's easy to understand. It means it's impossible to understand, because half of the Hebrew words you have in the Teichach of Parshas Kisavei are no place else in Tanakh except in this parsha. It's very difficult Hebrew. To learn Chitas of Friday this week, you must have English and you need time, because it's Pashat very long. So it's an interesting parsha Kisavei. It's a long parsha. And a significant portion of the parsha is the Teichacha, the curses, which are very, very painful to listen to. They're really very painful to listen to. In the Heilige Sfarim it says, in the holy books it's written, that Moshe Rabbeinu in Bechukoisai repeats from HaKadosh Baruch Hu 49 curses, 49 curses, 7 times 7 curses. In Parshas Kisavei you have 98, twice as many. 49 times 2 is 98, Tzach. This is the curse that Moshe Rabbeinu is giving on his own. Everything is doubled. But somehow the quantity is more and the quality is less. But these teichacha, these words of rebuke, this musir, which you have in our parsha, Parshas Kisavei, I gave a class this a couple of years ago. It's called divrei abris, the words of the covenant. The curses and the threats that the Eibishter makes to the Jewish people are not because Hashem is mean. It's because Hashem made a deal with us. And the deal the Eibishter made with the Jewish people is, we don't let him off the hook, and he doesn't let us off the hook. That's the nature of the deal. In other words, Hashem is stuck with us and we're stuck with him. And part of that is that Eibishter does whatever he needs to do to keep us here with him. And therefore the events in the Torah and the stories in our history that describe the tests and the challenges that the Jewish people had, some of them are very, very severe, but they're ultimately part of the covenant. I mean, the simple fact is, any way you want to explain it, we're here. The Jewish people are here right now. And we identify as children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who lived almost 4,000 years ago. And the Eibishter does what he needs to do to keep us here. And the processes in which the Eibishter keeps us here, when they are painful, are called divrei habris, the words of the covenant. This dominates Parshas Kisavei. It's not all of Parshas Kisavei, but it's the dominant feature of Parshas Kisavei. Kisavei has other things also. You have the very last mitzvahs in the Torah, Bikurim, Vidu Meiser, yesterday's Chitas, today's Chitas. Tomorrow's Chitas is all the 4 psukim. It's one of the most important Parshas in the whole Torah, which basically expresses how Hashem says, I love you and you love me. Tomorrow's Chitas, you have the word He'amarto and He'amircho, the word Aleph Mem Reish in that particular case means that there's a very, very special relationship between the Hashem and the Yidden and the Yidden and the Eibishter. Then you have you have other things also. You have Hargizim. Anyway, I want to speak to something else. The Chumash is finishing. It's the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. And I think what Moshe Rabbeinu does in the Chumash is a pattern that you see by all Gedolei Yisrael. And I'm going to put it in the language of a modern form, so you'll understand it in a very simple, practical way. Moshe Rabbeinu becomes a Rebbe in the year 2448. And he has a job to teach Yidden the Torah. He has a job to inspire the Jewish people. He has a job to make Fabrengenischen. I'm using the word Fabrengens because it's a word we can relate to. When Moshe Rabbeinu starts out as a Rebbe, his Fabrengens are very infrequent and they're probably pretty short. Moshe doesn't talk very often, doesn't talk very long. He gives people Yidden short speeches and he goes back to his tent, let the Jewish people work. At the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, Moshe Rabbeinu talks almost non-stop. The entire Sefer Dvarim is 37 days. The book of Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, which starts before Tisha B'Av, is Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Moshe passed away Zayin Adar. So Sefer Dvarim, which was 1/5 of the Chumash, in technical terms, was said and written in 37 days. Moshe Rabbeinu knows he's not going into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu knows he's passing away, and as they say in Yeshiva, he's chapping at ein. Every chance he gets to Fabring, he's doing. And I believe that this is a pattern that you see by many Gedolei Yisrael, that when they first become a leader, they speak less. And as their reign continues and they get closer and closer, so to speak, to the end, they want to take advantage of the last few minutes and they speak as much as possible. And this is really the story of Sefer Dvarim. Moshe Rabbeinu in 37 days speaks and speaks. Every chance he gets, he speaks. And to use a colloquial term, a fancy term, the source of the sermon is in Sefer Dvarim. Right? Rabbis give sermons. I saw in one of the Sodom of the Ramban that in Latin it's called sermiz. Samach Reish Mem Yud Zayin. Sermiz, sermons. Sermons mean speeches which are not law, they're not strict laws. They're what you would call today preaching. You know, fire and brimstone. You get up and you make a speech. You don't say what people should do or what people shouldn't do, but you fire them up about they should be careful not to forget the rules. They should be careful to keep it all. Sefer Devarim is a series of sermons. It's speeches. Very fiery Fabrengens, which are quite repetitive. Moshe says the same things many times over and over again. And he's trying to make people understand, the Herz Achei Yid, listen my children, I'm going away. And the departure, the death of Moshe Rabbeinu was an unsufferable loss, because Moshe was the first. There was a direct connection between Yiddishkeit and Moshe. There was no separation. Moshe was Torah, Torah was Moshe. And Moshe says, I'm going to pass away, you're going to go into Eretz Yisrael, you're going to have to fight many battles. Don't forget. And he says it over, and he says it over, and he says it over. One of the things that I say often, and I believe this is true, and I think there's a lot of evidence of it, that it's historically there have been many great people who lived, who during their lifetimes aroused many people to follow them, and then when they died, their movements died with them. There are many people who have accomplished great things in their lives, and when they passed away, whatever they stood for, whatever they preached, whatever they inspired, go in with them. That is not a truly successful person. It's a successful person in time. A truly successful person creates a movement, creates a philosophy, creates a derech, that when he passes away, it continues after him. That is very, very difficult to do. And if you'll study Jewish history, you'll see a pattern. That each one of the seconds, whoever came second, right? Avraham is the first, Yitzchak comes second. Moshe Rabbeinu is the first, Yeshua ben Nun comes second. And this is a pattern that you see over and over and over again. The Baal Shem Tov was the first, the Mizrach Maggid was the second. The Alter Rebbe is the first, the Mittler Rebbe was the second. The Arizal was the first, Reb Chaim Vital was the second. Any period history you look at, whoever was second in the beginning of a new movement created a small nucleus of very intense followers. Avraham Avinu was a very pluralistic leader, had thousands of followers. Yitzchak was Gevura, he did everything in a very concentrated way. His followers had to be perfect. The Baal Shem Tov was a very pluralistic Rebbe. The Mizrach Maggid was very, very narrow Rebbe. Why? Because if you come first, if you're the first, the movement and you are inexorable. Can't separate them. Chassidus and the Baal Shem Tov are the same thing. Then the Baal Shem Tov passes away. Now the Maggid comes. Maggid is only a student of the Baal Shem Tov. How is the Maggid going to see to it what the Baal Shem Tov taught should last past the Baal Shem Tov? The Maggid's solution is going to have a very small following, very small. But his followers are going to take the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov in a very perfect way. And through this handful of followers that are going to come after the Baal Shem Tov, he's going to, I don't mean this totally, but I mean this to an extent, he's going to separate the ideas from the person and make the ideas immortal. By the Mizrach Maggid having a small following and getting them to follow teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, Chassidus stopped being about the personality about the Baal Shem Tov. It became the ideas, and it lives in that small group. And the same is true. Yitzchak Avinu did the same thing. The Reb Chaim Vital did the same thing. I think you could say that the Mittler Rebbe did a similar thing as well. And Yeshua ben Nun is in the same position. Yeshua is after Moshe. But it's especially hard. You know why it's hard? Because Yeshua doesn't have the opportunity to simply continue what Moshe started. Moshe gave Yidden Torah. Yeshua has to fight wars. Fighting wars is not an optimum circumstance to worry about the preservation of the Torah. And Moshe is so aware of this. Moshe knows Yidden are going to go into Eretz Yisrael. He's not going to be there to maintain the Torah which is identified as his, Torah's Moshe. Yeshua is going to be busy with other things. Yeshua is going to be busy with fighting wars and dividing land. And it's going to make it very difficult for Yeshua to do what the second needs to do. So in Sefer Devarim, Moshe is preaching over and over and over again, don't forget the covenant, don't forget the covenant. And the Chazal say, Rashi brings it in Chumash, or at least it's in Sefer Yeshua, it's based on the Gemara, that when Moshe passed away, as long as Yeshua was alive, and as long as the Zakenim, She'arichu Yom Achei, the elders still lived, Yidden followed the Torah. The moment Yeshua passed away, the Yidden's spiritual level fell precipitously, significantly. And one way of explaining why this was, in some places they blame it a little bit on Yeshua, it's because Yidden did not get a chance to make Torah separate from Moshe. Because Moshe passes away, Yeshua couldn't do what the second normally does, which is preserve what Moshe gave. He was busy fighting wars. He had to start a whole new situation. And you could almost argue, and I think there's some truth to this, but this is sort of me speaking off the top of my head without authority, the second who preserved Torah, who gave Yiddishkeit their identity, lived hundreds of years later. The person who came after Moshe Rabbeinu, that really invented the Jewish people and the unity of the 12 Shvatim, was Shmuel HaNavi. So this is what you're reading in Sefer Devarim. You read Sefer Devarim, you see Moshe saying again and again and again and again, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. He says the same thing 4 or 5 or 6 times. And one of the things you have in our Pasha is the very end of the Pasha. This is Shvi, a Pasha's Kisave. I'm going to read and translate words. Vayikra Moshe kol Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu called the Jewish people together. Vayayim Aleim, and he tells them. He's been doing this a whole Devarim. He's been calling people. Atem re'isim, you all seen as kol asher asa Hashem. Everything that Hashem did leinechem to your eyes, you witnessed this. Be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt, lefare or l'chol avodah or l'chol asher, to the Pharaoh and his servants in his land. Hamasas hagedeles, the great miracles. Asher oeinecha, that your eyes saw, the great tests that your eyes saw. Ha'oises, the signs, v'amosim, and the miracles hagedelim mahim. And then it continues. V'loi nosan Hashem lochem. God Almighty has not given you leiv ladas, a heart to know, v'einayim l'reis, and eyes to see, v'aznayim l'shmai, and ears to hear, adayim, is till today. 40 years ago you went out of Mitzrayim. 40 years ago you were all children because the parents all died. 40 years ago you witnessed the Makis and Kriyas Yamsuf and Aseres HaDibris. It's 40 years later. I want you to know that until today, 40 years, you did not have a full heart to know, full eyes to see, and full ears to hear until now. And then he says, this is part of the reason we wandered through the desert for 40 years, but now it's the end of the 40 years. And Rashi says 2 things. Rashi says 2 things. The 40 years are ending, and Moshe tells the Jews, until now, you didn't have Leiv Ladas, and that's just 2 interpretations. Interpretation number 1. Moshe says, until now, I didn't know if you bought in. 40 years we're wandering in the desert, 40 years we're studying Torah, and for 40 years I did not know if you bought in. How do you see this? How do you see this phenomenon that after 40 years Moshe knows the Yidden bought in? So Rashi explains that the day Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, he wrote a Sefer Torah. Moshe wrote a Sefer Torah and he gave it to Shevet Levi. Moshe wrote 1 Sefer Torah, gave it to Shevet Levi. So the Yidden come running to Moshe Rabbeinu and they say, wait a minute. You're giving a Sefer Torah to Shevet Levi, right? That's your Shevet. In 50 years from today, and 100 years from today, they come and they say the Torah belongs only to them. This isn't fair. We want our own. And Chazal say Moshe Rabbeinu sits down and he writes 13 Sifrei Torah, 1 for Levi and 1 for each one of the 12 Shvatim. So Moshe had a lot of work to do. Moshe Rabbeinu passed away on a Shabbos, and Shabbos he's not allowed to write. So it's the 6th day of Adar, the Erev Zayin Adar, Moshe wrote 13 Sifrei Torahs and gave 1 Sifrei Torah to each Shevet. And Moshe says, now I know you bought in. Hashem has not given you Leiv Ladas, a heart to know. Eyes to see, ears to hear, meaning not you didn't know until now. I didn't know that you knew until now, that I see that you're genuine about the Torah because you're worried about the fact that someone is going to claim ownership of the Torah and you want to ascertain that the Torah should be yours. It's the first interpretation of Rashi. But then Rashi gives a second interpretation. And the second interpretation is quite different. The second interpretation of Rashi says, I'm reading inside Rashi, Ein Adam Eimid Al Seif Daite Shel Rabbi. A person never reaches the end of the understanding of his teacher. V'chochmas mishnasei, and the wisdom of his learning. Adar ba'im shana, for 40 years. If you're a student and you have a real teacher and he's a really smart guy and you're a great student, until 40 years under the tutelage of that person, you don't understand fully how his brain works. And Achei continues, Ulefichach, because of this, Lo hikpid aleichem hamakam, Hashem did not hold you responsible for Yiddishkeit ad hayom hazeh, until now. Avomikan, from this point forward, Yachpid, Hashem is going to be particular and be careful. So Rashi gets two very different interpretations. They're 40 years in the desert, and Hashem, Moshe says to Yid, now you have Leiv Ladas, Einayim L'Reishos, Einayim L'Shmoya. The first interpretation of Rashi is, now I know that you bought into Yiddishkeit. And the second interpretation is, now Hashem is going to hold you accountable, because after 40 years, you reach Soif Daita Shel Rabbi, you're able to know what your Rebbe knows, and Hashem is going to hold you accountable. In the expression of the Gemara, Ein Adam Emuz Al Rabbi Adar Boim Shnin Lekoyim Inish Daita Rabbi. Till 40 years, you don't fully understand the teachings of your teacher. This is what Rashi says in our parsha. So one of the last sermons of Moshe Rabbeinu has to do with the concept of 40 years. 40 years the Yidden are wandering, and Moshe says, now the 40 years are up, I know that you're in, and I want you to know that from now on going forward you're responsible, because Hashem says after 40 years you understand your teacher completely. So I want to tell you a piece of Chabad history. In 1990, Tov Shin Nun, the Rebbe reached 40 years of being a Rebbe, right? The Rebbe had the longest tenure of any of the Chabad Rebbeim. The Rebbe is the only Rebbe that served for 40 years. And Yud Shvat, I'll never forget it. It was a weekday. The Rebbe gave out green tanyas. The Rebbe came back from the oil and he started the Sikha with the words Vayehi Ba'arboyim Shona. It was very dramatic. I remember where I was standing. 770 was packed. The Rebbe came back from the oil and he started the Sikha with the words, it's 40 years. Vayehi Ba'arboyim Shona, 40 years. And the Rebbe spoke a long time. And the Rebbe spoke at length about this idea that we have in our parsha, that after 40 years, a student reaches the level of understanding of his teacher. Now we, standing in the room, understood, and probably correctly so, that the Rebbe was talking about himself and the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe passed away 40 years earlier. And after the Rebbe being a Rebbe for 40 years, Koyim Minish Adaita the Rebbe, you know what your teacher knows. And this idea that we have in our parsha, a heart to know, eyes to see, and ears to hear, there was a few months that the Rebbe repeated it over and over again. In 1990, when the Rebbe's tenure of Nesius was 40 years, there were a few months that Rebbe kept on saying the same thing. There's Arboim Shana, there's 40 years, you have Leiv Ladas, and it's over and over and over again. So here's a sweet story. Achei Nemaiseh. There was a Yid whose name was Rabbi Yeshia Korf. Rabbi Yeshia Korf was Opinion Korf's father. Rabbi Yeshia Korf, as they say in the culture, forgot to die. He died at 107. He went around twice. He missed his stop, so he stayed on for another round. He lived a very, very long life. It was a very, very long time. And he lived in pretty good health. Rabbi Yeshia Korf, Rabbi Korf, Opinion Korf's father. Rabbi Yeshia Korf was apparently a big Yirei Shamayim, very God-fearing. And he was a Shtikal Talmud Chacham Abarorian. And he was a very big chassid. And he had an unusual relationship with the Rebbe for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was he was called what's called a Shadar, Shin Dalad Rei. Shadar is abbreviation for Shlucha de Rachman. For those of you from California, the Reichiks gave out a book about their father, Rabbi Shmuel David Reichik, which is the Vashtavis of Shadar, Shin Dalad Rei, Shadar, because Rabbi Reichik was called a Shadar. A Shadar is a higher level even than a Shliach. It's a very special denotation that a very select group of Hasidim are given, even amongst the Shluchim. Shadarim have various missions. One of the missions that a Shadar has, it's an expression that goes back to the times of the Mittel Rebbe, Zeyin Ruchnis and Schneiden Gashim. Shadars are fundraisers. They raise money for the Rebbe. But fundraisers, wear nice ties and good cologne, they'll do a better job. Shadarim were Chassidish Yidden who planted Ruchnias and harvested Gashmias. One of the famous Shadarim was a great chassid by the name of Rabbi Hillel Parachir. The Mendel Futterfass was a Shadar, Rabbi Reichik was a Shadar. I have a friend who's a rabbi in a big city in America. And he told me Rabbi Reichik came to town together with Rabbi Futterfass. They were very respectable people and they went to ask people for money. And they went to the same people every year. There was a lady who gave them every day $18. Well, that wasn't money. They were raising millions, thousands. And they went every year to her house, and they took her $18 check, and they sat and they listened to her and they talked to her. And he saw what it means. Sehen, ruchen, und schneiden, gashmis. A Shadar goes around. He doesn't just ask people for money. He brings the Rebbe to Hasidim and to people, and Yiddishkeit to people. And he's also collecting funds, resources for the Rebbe. The Rebbe had Shadarim in every country. Different people were Shadarim. Rabbi Shia Korf was a Shadar to Toronto, to some places. If you were a Shadar, you would go to the cities that you were meant to go to, you would meet all the people, you would raise the money, you'd come back. You'd write up a very, very detailed account of all the people you met, their names, their wives' names, their children's names, how much money they gave, and you would bring it into the Rebbe. Even though the Rebbe was no longer seeing people privately, the Shadarim would go into the Rebbe and hand the Rebbe the names and the money that they raised when they were doing Shadaras. Rabbi Shia Korf took over somebody else's route, from what I understand. And he came into the Rebbe and he would give the Rebbe the report. And there was a rule by the Rabbeim. If you were a Shadar, you had to get paid. The Rabbeim did not want people working for free. If you worked for the Rebbe as a fundraiser, you needed to be paid. And if you did not agree to be paid, you couldn't work. That was the rule. Rabbi Shia Korf had the matzah bakery. He didn't need the Rebbe's few dollars that Rabbi Chadakov would give him for his percentage for being a Shadar. He didn't need it. So he told the Rebbe, I don't need the money. I'll do a Shadar as a volunteer. So the Rebbe told him the policy is if you don't take money, you can't work. You have to take payment, percentages, what you collect for Shadar, for your work. So Rabbi Shia Korf told the Rebbe, you know what? I'll take ruchnius. I won't take money. The Rebbe should give me spirituality. I'll take that instead. So the Rebbe said, what do you want? So he told the Rebbe, I want Leiv Ladas and Ayim L'Reis and Ayim L'Shmei, which is in our Pasha. I want a heart that knows and eyes that see and ears that hear. And the Rebbe takes a look and says, that's so much? I mean, what did you raise? $25? All that, Leiv Ladas and you want all of that for the few dollars that you raised in Toronto? So he tells him, you know what? I'll take one of them. I don't need all three. One is enough. A heart that knows, eyes that see, whatever one you want, I'll take one of them. So the Rebbe says, no. Don't take it back. You ask for all three. Stand on your request. And the Rebbe agreed. I don't know exactly what happened to Rabbi Shia Korf, but that's what happened. The Rebbe paid him back. In Ruchnius, Leiv Ladas, with a heart that knows, Einayim L'Reis, eyes that see, V'oznayim L'Shmai, and ears that hear. And this is the topic on Rabbi's side that I wish to speak to tonight. The concept of Leiv Ladas, Einayim L'Reis, V'oznayim L'Shmai. And I want you to think about this because I think that this is not just a nice Dvar Torah. I think this is it's a challenge. It's a provocation. It's a challenge that I think is very, very important. Okay? You need to understand something. How long are Yidden keeping Shabbos? 3,350 years, right? So is it a big deal to keep Shabbos? Unfortunately, some people don't keep Shabbos. If you're from Yid, you keep Shabbos. Right? How long are Yidden putting on tefillin? Right? But how long are Yidden going out onto the street and walking up to strangers and asking them, are you Jewish? In every generation, Moshe Rabbeinu comes and adds new things, right? It's not Teresh B'Ksav, it's not Teresh B'Al Peh, it's Chassidus. But when Moshe Rabbeinu comes along and adds those new things, those things are not familiar. So they're hard. They're hard for people to adapt. They're very difficult people to do because they're weird, they're different, they're not normal, they're not traditional, they're not what everybody is doing, and so on and so forth. And in every generation, the Gedolei Yisrael Amitim, the truly great Rebbes, make modifications. The Alter Rebbe was a Rebbe, he made modifications. The Mittler Rebbe was a Rebbe, he made modifications. And Chassidim got to hang on. And it's very difficult. You know, you'll always find the story of the Chassidim who were very, very connected to the Rebbe before. But this Rebbe, they got trouble with him. They tell a story about a certain Chassid who refused to learn with another Chassid because he only learned Maimarim of the Rebbe Maharash and he didn't learn Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab. So the Rebbe Rashab said to this man, why don't you want to learn with so and so? He says, he doesn't learn the Rebbe's Chassidus, he only learns the Rebbe's Fazl, it's no good for me, okay? That same Chassid, when the Frierdiker Rebbe became a Rebbe, continued to learn Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab. He had a very hard time making the Frierdiker Rebbe into his Rebbe. Till the day he died, he was learning Samach Vav. In other words, the same thing he accused the Chassid before him of doing, he was guilty of the same thing. When something happens that's new, it's very, very difficult to adapt to the new things. And if you know the history of our generation, there were the old Chassidim and there were the young Chassidim. The old Chassidim came from Lubavitch. They were very sincere and earnest Jews. They knew how to learn. They were big Yirei Shamayim. They knew a lot of Chassidus. But they had such a hard time with this new Rebbe, with his jumping up and down and the Zufaratzta and the Ra-Ra. To them it was nuts. And the Bachim had such an easy time with it. And the old and the young were at war. Mamish, in some places. The old were calling the young nuts. And the young were calling the old over the hill. The old were calling the young nuts. They're doing crazy things. The young were called the old over the hill because these crazy things were the Rebbe's advocacy. The Rebbe said do this, the Rebbe said do this. And the old people could not adapt, most of them. There's a story about a Yid who lived in Eretz Yisrael whose name was Harav Yitzchak Gansberg. Yitzchak Gansberg. He worked for the Rebbe his whole life. And he was a pretty crazy kind of guy. I knew him, he lived here. So he got a letter, the Rebbe got a letter from the leadership of Lubavitch and Eretz Yisrael that there's a man running around Israel embarrassing the name of Lubavitch and his name is Yitzchak Gansberg. So the Rebbe wrote them back a letter. He says, there's one man in Israel who's doing what I'm asking and you're saying that he's embarrassing the name of Lubavitch. That's how acute it gets. When the Rebbe comes up with new ideas, it takes a special kind of chassid to get on the bandwagon right away. You have to have a certain kind of bittul to say, oh, does Rebbe wants? Does Rebbe wants? That's it. Okay, new rules. The Rebbe can change rules on he wishes. Because most of us have patterns in our lives. Most of us do what we do because we're used to it. And when something new happens, we have a hard time adapting to new things. Now let me say what I just said, giving you another form. I'm going to repeat the same thing I just said, giving you a different example. You know the story with Shmuel Munkus? The Alter Rebbe ran away from the Russians who wanted to arrest him. And he went to a different town. And he came to a hotel. And he met Shmuel Munkus secretly. This is in the Rebbe's journal, the Rebbe's Neshimis. And the Alter Rebbe said to Shmuel Munkus, Shmuel, what do you think? He consulted one of his Chassidim. Shmuel, what do you think? I should allow myself to be arrested or not? So Shmuel Munkus said, yeah, I think you should allow to be arrested. So the Alter Rebbe said, Shmuel Munkus, but it's Pekuach Nefesh. I'm risking my life. I have an option. I'm hiding now. They don't know where I am. I can run away. I can go to Germany and live the rest of my life in peace. And no one's going to bother me. So Shmuel Munkus told the Alter Rebbe the famous words, which have been repeated many times. If you're a Rebbe, a bullet won't hurt you. And if you're not a Rebbe, you deserve a bullet. Who gave you the right to deprive thousands of Jews, tens of thousands of Jews, from the pleasures of the material world? That's the quote. If you're a Rebbe, if you're a real Rebbe, bullets are not going to touch you. If you're not a Rebbe, you deserve a bullet. Who gave you the right to steal from so many Jews the pleasures of this world? Now you have to understand the pshat. If a guy sits his whole life and learns Torah, and he's surrounded by a community of B'nai Torah, and everything is Torah and everything is Yiddishkeit, yeah? What kind of Gashmis does he have? Well, the answer to that question is, it's a beautiful life. It's a life that his father practiced, and his grandfather practiced, and his great-grandfather practiced. It's a beautiful life of Torah. Okay, they have a lot of money, but they have other things. But when a Rebbe comes along and he changes the rules, when a Rebbe comes along and says, until now we did this, so now we're doing something else, the Chassidim who follow him, as the expression in business, who get into the ground floor, are doing things that they're completely unaccustomed to. That is hard. And that is the meaning of the words, that is the meaning of that statement. Stealing from Jews the pleasure of this world means the pleasure of this world could be also a Gemara with a cup of coffee. The meaning of the pleasures of this world that's taken away from you means to introduce a derech and avodas Hashem which they're not comfortable, they're used to. And you should know that's a chassid. The definition of a chassid is he follows his Rebbe when it isn't popular. The definition of a chassid is he follows his Rebbe when it's not comfortable for him. The definition of a chassid is that Nachshon ben Aminadav, that vanguard, that what they call the expeditionary force, the first soldiers who are able to follow a Rebbe, a tzaddik, a nasi b'Yisrael that makes all kinds of changes that no one is used to yet. They're strange, they're unusual, they're different. And that lasts for 40 years. After 40 years, the new becomes old. And this is what we are living now. Today, Lubavitch is, Baruch Hashem, still crazy, that we still have that distinction. But Lubavitch, in spite of all the things, is more respected by the frum world now than ever. And more respected by the Freie world than ever. Why? Because Lubavitch is no longer a surprise. Lubavitch is no longer doing everyday new stuff that you know what kind of Meshugas came up next. Why? Because it's a Boim Shana. The Rebbe introduces a whole new path. Some people sign on and some people don't sign on. After 50 years, everyone's a chassid. No problem. To do Mivtzayim today, everyone does Mivtzayim. Do Mivtzayim. It was the difficulty of being the first. And the reason it's so difficult to be the first is because you don't even understand yourself what you're doing. The Rebbe said, do this, I'm doing it, doesn't make sense to me, I don't understand it, I don't see the point, I don't see the purpose, I don't see the benefit, you follow. Because for 40 years, new ideas are not in the world. After 40 years, everybody said, sure, I love that, Mivtzayim is a great idea. Even Mashiach's a good idea. But when the ideas are introduced, and they're foreign, and they're alien, and they're weird, so half the world calls you Meshuggah. The other half of world calls you by names that you can't say in a shul. And the Chassidim follow their Rebbe. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to the Jews. You got the 30, 40 years ago. Now, Torah is normal. It's your way of life. Until now, every time you did a mitzvah, it was weird. Why? You didn't grow up with it. In Mitzrayim, they kept Shabbos. In Mitzrayim, they ate kosher. In Mitzrayim, they put on film. So they were doing these things. And they were doing it because Hashem told them to do it. Moshe Rabbeinu told you, you didn't listen. Moshe says, 40 years have passed since I gave you the Torah. Now the Torah is integrated. Now the Torah is something which, as the expression is, it's a way of life. It's no longer a radical, extreme kind of a thing. And there's three components to it. Lev ladas, a heart that knows. Einayim l'reis, eyes that see. Vaznayim l'shma, and ears that hear. All of these three components, the Rebbe says in the Sikha, that he said on the 40th occasion of his Nesias, they're chokhmah bina das. But first, lev ladas is das. Einayim l'reis is chokhmah. And Vaznayim l'shma is bina. Why? Because when the Rebbe gives instructions, and you sign on, when it isn't cool, it isn't popular, that has to come from a place in yourself which is so deep that it's called Das Elyon, Das, which is higher than Chochmah and Bina. So 40 years have passed. The Yidden are going into Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe says, listen here, people. The Yiddishkeit I gave you, from now on, is normal. You're no longer a radical because you keep Shabbos, because you put on film. There'll be new radicalisms. There'll be new chidushim. Yeshua ben Nun is going to be the next Rebbe. He's taken to Israel. He's going to have to fight wars. And there's going to have to be a few, as they say in the Marines, a few good men who are going to have the courage and have the guts and have the wherewithal and have the discipline and have the humility to follow Yeshua when he asks them to do things that are not part of the familiar mandate. But Torah, the Chumash, the Tayag Mitzvahs, Moshe says, from now on, being a frum Yid, this is a way of life. Until today, being a frum Yid with things that you did, that you were not comfortable with, you're not accustomed to. But 40 years have passed since it started. Now it's integrated, it's a part of you. And you should understand, I'm reading a book. My son is he's a very interesting boy, one of my sons. And he bought a book on the Kotzker Rebbe, on the Menachem Mendel of Kotzk, and I'm reading it. And Menachem Mendel of Kotzk was a radical, a fascinating personality. And he was so radical in the world of Chassidus that there were a lot of Chassidish Rebbes who wanted Rahman al-Zan to put him into Achei. He was the same as Tzemach Tzedek. He passed away in 1859, Tzemach Tzedek passed away in 1866. They were the same name also, Menachem Mendel. They never met, but they knew each other quite well. The Mendel of Kotzker was asked by a Chassid, why he has to change everything? Well, Chassidus is a beautiful way of life. The Baal Shem Tov, the Mezritch HaMagid, the Reb Noam Elimelech, the Chayzim Lublin. Why does he make all these changes? So the Kotzker Rebbe says, I'll tell you why. What's your question? What was wrong with Yiddishkeit without the Baal Shem Tov? What was wrong with Gemara and Halacha? You can be a fruit. What's have Chasidus? And the answer is, everything that you're used to, you can fall asleep doing. You can become complacent. Mitzvahs are nashim alubada. The Baal Shem Tov came along and he rocked the boat. Created a new movement, a new energy, a new enthusiasm. But you know what? The Baal Shem Tov can get old and stale too. Baal Shem Tov can become things that you do by habit, there's no energy. So just like the Baal Shem Tov made a revolution to wake Yidden up, and when he made that revolution, he was condemned by the whole world. Who's this Meshuggah making all new rules? I've come along to the Kotzker Rebbe to make all kinds of changes in the world of Chassidus, to wake up Chassidus. It shouldn't be verschlafen. So there's this strange balancing act. One side of that coin is, the things we do as Jews have to become normal. Today, to go on Mivtzoyim is so much easier than it was many years ago. Not only because you're used to going on Mivtzoyim, but because the person on the street is used to being stopped and asked, are you a Jew? When it started, it was a radical idea. You have to be really crazy to be able to do it. No one understood what the Rebbe was trying to accomplish. Today, it makes sense. The other side of that coin is, when things become established and things become normal, they can become complacent. They can lose their energy. And that's why there's always new ideas. There's a new Rebbe, there's new Chidushim, there's new ideas. When a Rebbe introduces new ideas in the beginning, a few people follow. Those few people, right, to use the language of Lubavitch, the first generation of Shluchim, who are now in their 80s, who had much less success than their children and grandchildren who came after them. Those few younger lights, who went on Shlichus in the 1950s and the 1960s, who had such Mesiras Nefesh, it was so hard. And the Shlichus was difficult. Everybody hated them. The Frumen, the Freie, the establishment, and everybody fought with Lubavitch. If you want to read about Lubavitch's Harpatkois, read what's his name's book. Eliezer has a book, The Secret of Chabad. You'll read what Shluchim went through. But those men signed on to the Rebbe's army when even Lubavitch didn't want to listen to him. Today it's cool. Today it's the in thing. And that's what Moshe says. It's not hard anymore. Now it's a way of life. Hashem says at this point, if you're not going to keep the mitzvahs, I can hold it against you. You know why? Because this doesn't require it to be crazy. Not to keep Shabbos is to be crazy. But that creates a whole new challenge. And the new challenge is, what happens if you become so accustomed to doing the mitzvahs that they lose their luster, they lose their chayas, they lose their originality, lose their energy. And then you have to create another energy, another revolution, and another 40 years, and another Lev Ladas. So the Rebbe said when he turned 40 years of the Nesias, and I'm now going to say that he wasn't talking about the Frierdik Rebbe. He's talking about himself. I've been a Rebbe for 40 years, and now being a Lubavitcher is not crazy. It's normal. And it's true. For us, it's very different than it was for 2 generations ago. Shlichus and outreach and the Avos Yisrael, which the Rebbe preached and taught. But we have the opposite test, which is, don't let it become old. Don't let it become meaningless. Don't let it become rote. Because after 40 years, it's not crazy anymore. Now it's normal. But even though it's normal, it has to have a certain energy. And this is one of Moshe last messages. 40 years have passed. Being a Yid is now normal. A, Hashem is going to hold it against you if you don't do it correctly. And B, don't fall asleep doing it. Might have.